Do you ever get that after lunch sleepy feeling, like you've hit a wall? Turns out there's a similar effect in customer experience.
There's a whole group of people where they've made some changes to the experience itself, and they've started to make some changes to the operations and the culture, but they feel like they've hit this invisible wall.
Let's talk about how companies can push past the feeling of getting stuck in their CX program on this episode of the CX Leader Podcast.
The CX Leader Podcast with Steve Walker is produced by Walker, a business consulting firm that helps our clients unlock the potential of their customer experiences by placing the customer at the heart of all their business decisions. You can find out more at walkerinfo.com.
Hello, I'm Steve Walker, Chairman and CEO of Walker Information, and also the host of the CX Leader Podcast, and thank you for listening to this episode. On the CX Leader Podcast, we explore the topics and themes to help leaders like you leverage all the benefits of customer experience and help your customers and prospects want to do more business with you and your company. The CX Leader Podcast really has become the place for CX leaders and business executives who are interested in putting the customer at the center of their strategy. I'm delighted to keep getting your feedback and really appreciate your listenership. My guest today is a well-known name and a customer experience expert, and she researches some of the latest discoveries in behavioral science and then applies that for companies who want to improve their customer experience. Before she started her own business, she was a vice president and principal analyst at Forrester. You can find her advising companies on improving their customer experience and keynoting at several notable conferences and summits, including Walker's own B2B Summit, which was held last fall. Megan Burns is a familiar name, good friend of mine and of the company, and she is currently the CEO of Experience Enterprises, and she is joining me today via Zoom. Megan, thank you for being a guest on the CX Leader Podcast.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Well, I'm delighted. We should have had you on way before now, given all of your accomplishments and everything you've done. So thanks for making some time today.
My pleasure.
My pleasure, too. Just for the benefit, and you hardly need an introduction in this space, but realizing that some of our listeners are new, why don't you just give a little more background and perspective on your career and how you really got to the place that you're at today?
Sure. And it's really, I think, an interesting story for anybody who's thinking about getting into customer experience. So I actually started my career as a software engineer, but I always knew that I cared more about the people who were going to be using the technology than I did about the technology. And that led me to focus early on requirements engineering, helping figure out, okay, what does the software have to do and who does it have to do it for? And that led to a lot of work on user experience and website usability. And that was when I made the transition over to Forrester. At the time, customer experience was practically synonymous with user experience in that team. We were trying to make the case that your website doesn't exist in a vacuum and that customer experience should be a broader enterprise level concern. And frankly, nobody was ready to hear that. This was 2006, 2007. And then suddenly in 2008, 2009, after the economic crash, people started flocking to the idea of how do we retain our customers and how do we make sure that we're the company they keep doing business with if they're cutting back their business elsewhere. And that was when I broadened my research perspective to enterprise level customer experience and understanding, well, what does it mean to think about and manage and measure this across an entire corporation? And so that led to things like the maturity model. At the time, people were sort of like, okay, we know we need to transform, but what do we need to transform to? And so the goal with that was to say, when you get good at customer experience, here's what should be happening in your organization. So it's been a fun, interesting learning ride, but I'm really excited to kind of pause and look back and see how far we've come as a space, because it's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, you said a couple things that are really interesting to me. You know, I've been in the business probably too long at this point, but I remember in some of the early driver models when we first started to see websites starting to pop in, and in certain industries where the website was becoming actually a touch point that was very impactful on the customer experience. And obviously prior to that, before the web and before e-commerce, that would not have been the case. And then I think also the kind of the concept of, how the technology was less interesting to you than the people aspect of it. And at some level, sort of the resistance to kind of take this as a broader perspective within the organization.
Yeah.
Given your history, and now that you're at this point and you've started your own shop, kind of give us your take on with where you've come. Where's the CX initiative been? And how's it gotten to the point where it is today? What are some of the key factors from your perspective that you see that have made this such a key business issue today?
It's a great question. And there's a couple of different things that stand out. One is the fact that customer experience is not a new idea. Early on, many of the people who were attracted to the idea of an enterprise customer experience program were people who had been really bullish on CRM in the early days. And to them, CRM wasn't a technology. It was a philosophy and a way of doing business, managing relationships with customers. And a lot of people at the time told me that they felt like the term and the idea had been co-opted and turned into a technology. And so they were excited for an opportunity to take this thing that sort of seems like it should be common sense and try to give it another go. And in a lot of companies at the time, just getting feedback from customers, people weren't even doing that, right? One of the things that made Net Promoter Score, NPS, attractive to people was if you're not getting feedback from customers and you want to start, you don't need a 40-item survey. Here's 2 questions you can ask to get you going. And so that helped get more and more people to this place of actually understanding their customer experience and at least reacting to it. But I think we've reached the point where the lion's share of companies are realizing that reacting to bad customer experiences after they happen is not enough, right? They've got to be more proactive. They've got to be more deliberate about customer experience. And that means making it something they think about and manage as much as products or services or channels. And that's a tough leap for people to make, going from, okay, I understand what a customer feedback program is, to how do I kind of embed this into all the nooks and crannies of my business? And what does that look like on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I know we were talking offline a little bit about what the current state is today, and you had kind of an interesting analogy, but I think you were starting to get at that is what is the state today, and what do you see in terms of your work where companies are either having success or maybe where they're struggling to go to the next level?
Yeah, there's a couple different buckets. We still have companies, some really big companies who are just getting started with customer experience. And what's exciting for me about that and what I tell them is a lot of the questions we had in the early days, what is this? How do we talk about it? We know the answers to those now. So they can jumpstart a lot more quickly than companies that, were in the early sort of pioneering days of this. But there's a whole group of people in the middle, and I think this is probably most of the industry, where they've made some changes to the experience itself. And they've started to make some changes to the operations and the culture, but they feel like they've hit this invisible wall, or like they're stuck, trying to make their way up this hill of something's different. It's not just a different set of tasks, it's a different way of thinking. And that sort of invisible bump, they're not quite sure how to push past it. And so I'm hearing a lot from people about how do we go to the next level. So I think we're really at an important inflection point for the field as well as for the people in the field who need to figure out how to influence a bigger swath of the business in a more sophisticated way.
My guest this week on the CX Leader podcast is Megan Burns, well known to many of you, and she is the CEO of Experience Enterprises. Megan, maybe you could give kind couple of examples, either good or bad, maybe one of each, of sort of how people are dealing with the invisible hump or bump or wall that, where you've seen maybe a company persevere through it, or maybe where you've seen something really get derailed?
Sure, there are a couple of great examples. I had one person come to me and describe, she called it a fist pump moment, where she really felt like she had made a difference. And it was when she got a call from the head of risk management in her company. And he said to her, "We've got this thing, this project that we are deciding on whether or not to do. And by all of our traditional risk management criteria, this is something we should do and we should go ahead with. But I just have this nagging feeling that there's something from a customer experience perspective we're not factoring in. And I want to make sure we think about that before we go ahead and pull the trigger." That's, I think, one of the best examples I've ever heard of really starting to embed customer experience governance and experience-centered decision-making into parts of the business that are there and are always going to be there. Another example came from an attorney. Someone told me about a conversation they were having with an attorney in their organization. And the attorney described having this aha moment that if they were customer-centric, the goal of contract negotiations was not to win or to get the best possible deal and beat the customer. It was to come up with something that both sides thought was fair and equitable. And that was a big mind shift for the attorney. It had very much been about front lines for employees who interact with customers. Well, if employees are soldiers on the front line, who is the customer then? Does that mean they're the enemy? That's not what we're going for.
That's awesome, Megan. I've always said that customer experience needs to be, by its very nature, it has to be cross-functional and pervasive throughout the whole organization. I think we talk real confidently about, technical support or customer service or sales being impacted, but when you're talking about legal and risk management, that shows an adoption of the philosophy beyond, I think, even what many of us thought would ever happen 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where I think people have the hardest time envisioning or helping others envision what this looks like on a day-to-day basis. We as CX professionals. So I think we need to get a little more educated about some of these other domains and understand, okay, what do these people actually do all day? And how do they think about what they do so that we can help them figure out where CX fits into that activity?
Megan, if I'm a customer experience professional out there and I'm listening to this podcast and you really want to impart one piece of wisdom on me, what one or two things would you advise the customer experience professional to really be focused on today to enhance their professional development and or their company's CX program?
It's a great question. The first thing I would say is trust. I wrote about an article about this late last year. Trust is one of those things that is a catalyst and can have a snowball effect. And we think a lot of times about whether or not our customers trust us, but we don't necessarily think about whether employees trust each other. And the research is really clear that high trust cultures perform better, but they also are higher on some of the exact kinds of changes we're trying to drive in customer experience. When trust goes up, people are more empathetic. They're more collaborative. They're more likely to work together across silos and not be so strict about us and them boundaries. And trust is something really tangible, right? There's a lot of research. There are a lot of tangible things we can do to improve trust. So that's the first thing I would say to focus on, because it's tangible and there's a lot of data supporting it, and it creates this snowball effect for other things that we're ultimately trying to do. The second thing is sort of related, which is that we've got to remember that change happens one person at a time. We talk about transforming organizations, but organizations are just groups of people. And whether we like it or not, and this comes up a lot for me because I'm an individual, I'm not going to do some massive implementation project for a company. But what I can do is influence people who are influential to start this chain. And I think sometimes when it feels overwhelming, just bringing it back to, okay, change happens one person at a time. Who are the most important people for us to drive change with and in, and how can we move that forward? And that, I think, makes people feel like this is a little bit more doable on a human scale than sometimes talking about the big picture can make it seem.
That's great. That's going to be some really good take-home value for our listeners. Hey, Megan, why don't you look into your crystal ball? I know you're kind of future-focused generally, but what are some of the trends and what do you think are some of the key issues that are going to impact us over the next few years?
Well, there are the trends that I think people are talking about, and then there are the trends that I think people should be talking about.
Ooh.
I think there's a lot of discussion and conversation around things like artificial intelligence, when in reality, most companies are pretty far away from using that in customer experience. And so it's interesting and futuristic to think about, but we need to make sure that that doesn't distract us from the basic work of when we are interacting with people, not through artificial intelligence, how do we make those interactions more emotionally intelligent? I'm also hearing a lot from people about emotion and how do we understand emotion in customer experience. We talk a lot about empathy, but there's a sort of a kissing cousin to empathy, which is perspective taking. It's not necessarily that I feel what you're feeling, but I'm able to see the world from your perspective. And companies are really looking to move beyond the numbers to understand who these customers are as human beings. And I think that's a great trend. And I think it's one that was in part precipitated by survey fatigue, right? We've gotten a lot of what we could get out of numbers, but there's still something more we need. And that's pushing people to look at other avenues for customer research.
That's awesome. What about technology? Where do you think technology is going to take us?
I have an interesting perspective on this, and it's probably pretty funny for someone who started their career as a technologist, but I very often think that people put too much weight on what technology can or can't do. You know, there are a lot of companies out there who are trying to use technology to optimize customer experience, but they haven't stepped back and thought about the overall model of how they interact with customers. So what they're basically doing is tuning up a 15-year-old car. I do think that technology will continue to be obviously a huge investment. I would like to see technology become something that helps us scale, helps us build relationships with people despite the fact that we're across distances, and also abstract away some of the basic stuff, right? We talk a lot about Uber and companies becoming the Uber of X. And one of the things that Uber does brilliantly is abstract away a lot of annoying details, like paying when I get out of the car. I don't have to worry about it. I just get out of the car and go. And technology gives us the opportunity to abstract a lot of that away so that the customer doesn't worry about it, which gives us a chance to focus and help them focus on the higher order goals.
Hey, Megan, tell our listeners how they might be able to get a hold of you or how they might be able to stay in contact with you.
Absolutely. So if anybody wants to talk about this, you can email me at Megan, MEGAN, at exp-ent.com. Or I'm on LinkedIn, and you can engage me in a conversation there, follow me. You can use that email address to connect with me. And that's also where I post most of my video content, trying to start a conversation around some of this more down in the weeds culture transformation.
And your company website is experienceenterprises.com?
Yes.
Great. Well, again, Megan Burns is the CEO of Experience Enterprises. She's been our guest on the CX Leader podcast today. If you have been living in a cave in the CX world and you didn't know Megan before, now you do. and I really encourage you to keep up with her. She's definitely one of the thought leaders in our whole space. Megan, thanks a million for being on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Steve. It was a lot of fun.
And if you want to talk about anything else we discussed or about how Walker can help your business customer experience, you can contact me at steve.walker@walkerinfo.com or call me here in the U.S. at 1-317-843-8890. Don't hesitate to reach out to me or any of my colleagues. We'd love to talk to you more. Don't forget to subscribe to the CX Leader Podcast. You can go to walkerinfo.com/podcasts and you'll find links to iTunes, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Google Play, and our own YouTube channel as well at youtube.com/walkerinformation. Thank you for listening to this episode of the CX Leader Podcast, which is a production of Walker. We're a business consulting firm that can help you make customer experience your biggest competitive advantage. Find out more at walkerinfo.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again next time.